John Mercer, a weary war veteran, faced a cruel injustice when the mysterious chest he guarded was stolen from his cabin, taking with it a secret that could change everything. The stranger who took it moved with quiet precision, as if driven by a conviction that the truth inside was too dangerous to be known. But John refused to give up, tracking the thief to a hidden warehouse and choosing to reveal the chest's contents to the world. Just wait until you hear how this choice turned his life around, and why justice ultimately prevailed in a story filled with sacrifice and meaning. John Mercer had learned long ago that the heaviest burdens were invisible. At 42, he bore them every day. Scars from his time in Iraq weren't in his skin. They lived deep in his mind, in the restless nights, in the hollow feeling when he looked in the mirror. Since leaving the service, life had become a series of stops and starts. Odd jobs that paid just enough to scrape by, cheap motels that smelled of mildew, and Buck, his German shepherd, the only constant. Buck was more than a dog. He was a companion who seemed to understand when silence was more important than words. The decision to rent the small cabin in rural Ohio was born of quiet desperation. John didn't want a house. He didn't want people. He wanted a place far enough from noise that he could hear himself think. The cabin was modest, a single room with a creaking floor, a wood stove that never burned evenly, and the faint smell of old pine. But it was his. That night, the wind was thick with rain. Water tapped against the roof in uneven rhythms, a restless percussion. Buck lay curled at the foot of John's bed, ears flicking with every distant sound. John had been asleep less than an hour when a low whining stirred him. He stirred lazily, brushing it off as Buck's usual restlessness. But then came the scratching, faint at first, then more persistent. John sat up. "What is it, boy?" His voice was gravelly, tired. Buck's eyes gleamed in the dim light as he padded over to the far corner of the cabin. He pawed at the floor again and again with an insistence that made John frown. He pulled on a robe and stepped over, leaning down to examine the spot. At first glance, it was nothing, just a worn board that seemed older than the rest of the floor. But Buck's digging had loosened it. John pried at the board with his fingers. It gave way with a dull creak, revealing a shadowed cavity beneath. Inside lay a chest, heavy, rusted, and sealed shut with no visible lock. The surface was covered in strange engravings, patterns that seemed almost deliberate, but whose meaning John could not decipher. He ran a hand over it, the metal cool and rough under his fingertips. The scent of old wood and something faintly metallic drifted upward. John felt a sharp pull in his chest. A part of him recoiled, a soldier trained to be cautious, to avoid traps. But another part of him leaned in. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, a whisper that this chest was not an accident, that it had waited for him. He stepped back, brushing rain from his sleeve. Buck sat beside him, head tilted, watching the chest as if it held the answers to questions John didn't yet know he had. For years, John's life had been a maze of shadows and unanswered questions. After the war, he had walked through corridors of silence, wondering if there was anything left to fight for. Now, in the dim light of the cabin, the chest felt different. It was heavy in more ways than one. It felt like a challenge. John pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, its beam cutting a narrow line through the darkness under the floorboards. The chest sat there, silent, sealed, waiting. Outside, the rain pressed against the cabin, as though urging him to look closer. John's fingers tightened around the flashlight. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him knew this was the beginning of something. though he could not yet say what. Buck shifted beside him, letting out a low, questioning whine. John looked down at him and gave a small nod. "Yeah, boy," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." The chest remained quiet, but for John, that night marked a shift. In the stillness, something stirred, a spark of intrigue. And somewhere deep in that spark, John Mercer felt the pull of a mystery he could not ignore. John Mercer woke the next morning with the weight of the chest heavy in his thoughts. It wasn't just wood and metal anymore. It had become something personal, a question he could not leave unanswered. He tried crowbars, hammers, even improvised tools he found in the small shed behind the cabin. Each attempt left the chest unbroken. Its surface seemed to mock him, the strange engravings almost glowing faintly in the early light. John started carrying a notebook. Each evening he sat cross-legged beside the chest, sketching the patterns, noting every detail. The symbols seemed like a language, but one he could not decipher. Sometimes Buck would rest his head on John's knee, eyes half closed, as if sensing the weight of the mystery pressing down on them both. At night, John slept beside the chest, using it as a strange kind of anchor, something solid in a world that had felt untethered for years. It was during one of those evenings that John began asking questions of the few neighbors who still lived within walking distance. Old Martha at the general store first laughed when he brought it up. Then she leaned in close and lowered her voice. "That cabin, it belonged to a man named Harold Grayson, World War II veteran, lived here alone for years. Nobody saw him much. Folks said he kept secrets. Some said he hid something, a fortune. Others said letters, stories, truths no one was meant to know." John listened, his brow furrowing. He knew that feeling, the weight of secrets, the burden of truths buried deep. Harold Grayson had lived like John now, quiet, alone, carrying something that no one could share. For reasons he could not name, John felt an odd kinship with him. Two soldiers, separated by decades, both carrying invisible scars. The thought stayed with him, but so did a new unease. A week later, John noticed someone following him around town. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but the man was persistent, always at the edges of his day, sharp-eyed, plain clothes, an unreadable expression. John saw him asking questions at the hardware store, at the cafe, even at the gas station, always asking about a cabin on Miller's Lane, always listening more than he spoke. John's curiosity twisted into caution. He began taking different routes, avoiding the small circle of roads he usually traveled. Buck seemed to notice too, growling low whenever the man appeared nearby. But John couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew about the chest, that it wasn't just his mystery anymore. At night, by the light of a small kerosene lamp, John would study the engravings again. They seemed less like symbols and more like fragments of a story that belonged to someone else, someone who had gone to great lengths to hide it. The more he thought about Harold Grayson, the more John believed that opening the chest might mean uncovering something far bigger than himself. Something dangerous. Yet despite the risk, John felt a strange pull of compassion toward the chest and the man who had hidden it. Perhaps it was because he saw a part of himself in Grayson. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in years, John was protecting something bigger than his own life, a story that deserved to be found. But with every question answered, new ones rose in its place. Who was the stranger asking questions around town? Why had someone taken such care to seal the chest? And most of all, What truth lay hidden inside? John looked down at Buck, who sat patiently beside him, watching the shadows shift across the floorboards. "We're in deeper than I thought, boy," he murmured. Buck whined softly, as if answering. That night, John lay awake, listening to the rain fall again. The cabin felt smaller somehow, filled with the weight of a secret it had been keeping far too long. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the dark, John could feel something changing. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about responsibility. And John knew that whatever lay inside the chest, opening it would change everything. John woke to the sound of silence that wasn't silence at all. It was a quiet that carried something wrong. He sat up, muscles taut, every sense alert. The cabin felt different, colder, emptier. Buck was no longer at the foot of the bed. A low growl rose in the darkness, sharp and cautious. John swung his boots on and grabbed his flashlight. The beam fell across the floor, cutting through the shadow. The corner where the chest had rested was gone. There was nothing but a bare patch of warped floorboards. They were pried apart, splintered. The chest was gone. A rush of rage and fear twisted inside him. Rage at the violation of his sanctuary. Fear at the fact that someone had not only found the chest, but also knew exactly where to take it. Whoever they were, they had planned this. They had known John would guard it. But they still took it. Buck pressed close to his side, low growls rumbling in his throat. John crouched beside the gap in the floor, his hands resting on splintered wood. His mind spun. Questions raced. Why? Who? Where? The days after were worse than that first night. Desperation set in like a living weight. John called old comrades, voices from a past he had tried to leave behind. None had answers. Some were gone. Others gave vague assurances that dissolved the moment they were spoken. He hired a private investigator, but the trail ended cold. No sign of the chest, no trace of the intruder. Each night became harder to face. Buck, once calm and watchful, paced in restless circles, ears twitching at every sound. John would sit with him in silence, the absence of the chest heavier than anything else in the cabin. In his dreams, the chest was always just out of reach, locked, unopenable. Sometimes he dreamed it was speaking to him, telling him something urgent, something he could never quite hear. Every lead he followed ended in frustration. Neighbors who claimed they hadn't seen anything. Surveillance cameras that revealed nothing but shadows. Whispers of a man in plain clothes asking questions in town, a name that slipped away before it could be remembered. John began to feel the truth he had resisted. This was no longer about curiosity, it was about loss, and the loss was eating at him. For a man who had survived war, who had faced fear under fire, this was a different kind of battle. This was helplessness. The enemy was invisible. There were no uniforms to confront, no clear objectives to claim. The chest had been stolen, and with it had gone something he couldn't put into words, not just a secret, but a piece of himself. It was more than wood and metal now. The chest was a symbol of unfinished battles, of promises he had made to himself, of the hope he had clung to in the quiet of the cabin, and now all of it was gone. John stopped sleeping properly. Nights were long and restless. Buck stayed close, as if sensing the storm in his owner's mind. John walked the floors at all hours, running his hands over the worn wood where the chest had sat. Every time, his fingers trembled. He thought of Harold Grayson, the old veteran who had once owned the cabin. Had he lost something like this too? And if so, what had he done about it? John knew he was no longer dealing with a mystery. He was dealing with a wound that grew deeper every day. One evening, John sat outside the cabin with Buck beside him. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier. The wind carried the sound of rustling leaves and something else, the sense that the world had shifted. He looked down at Buck, whose eyes reflected something more than worry. They reflected determination. John didn't speak. But in that moment, he knew something had changed. The chest was gone. So was his peace. But what had not gone was his resolve. And somewhere deep inside, he realized he was about to go further than he had ever gone before to find it. Weeks passed in a blur of restless searching. John Mercer followed every lead he could find, driven by something he no longer tried to name. Every road, every whisper, every shadow seemed to pull him toward the same truth. Buck never left his side. Wherever John went, Buck was there, a quiet presence, steady and unrelenting. One late afternoon, a tip led him to a rundown warehouse on the far edge of town. The building was hidden behind overgrown weeds and cracked concrete, a place long abandoned except for whatever had found refuge inside. John approached cautiously, Buck close at his heels. Rain had begun again, washing the world in gray light. Through a rusted door, John slipped inside. The air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of oil and old wood. In the center of the room, under a faded tarp, sat the chest. Its surface was scarred but unmistakable. John's breath caught. This was the moment he had been chasing. A man stepped out from the shadows, sharp-eyed, plain clothes, the same man John had seen around town. He didn't flinch when John entered. His voice was steady. "You found me," he said quietly. "I suppose that was bound to happen." John didn't answer. He studied the chest. The man stepped closer. "It's not what you think," he said. "It's not treasure. This chest contains letters, maps, diaries, evidence, proof of war crimes, debts that were never paid, a soldier's last sacrifice. I've been guarding it because I believed the truth was too dangerous to be exposed." The words fell like stones in John's chest. He stared at the stranger, then at the chest itself. Years of war, years of silence, had led him here. This was not a prize. This was a story, a burden someone had chosen to hide. John's mind raced. He could take it, vanish, claim whatever was inside for himself. The temptation was there. Safety, wealth, a way to escape the years of struggle. But as he looked down, Buck stepped forward and nudged him gently toward the chest, as if urging him to make the right choice. John exhaled slowly. He knew what he had to do. He pulled aside the tarp and opened the chest. Inside, stacked neatly, were bundles of letters yellowed with age, maps marked with strange symbols, diaries written in careful handwriting. He read, absorbed. The truth was heavier than he expected. John took photographs of the contents and recorded their details. Then he contacted a veteran advocacy group, handing over everything. The decision was not easy. It meant losing control of whatever power the chest might hold. But John knew some truths were bigger than himself. The exposure that followed was intense. Long-hidden truths became public. The world learned of debts unpaid, of sacrifices forgotten, of stories that needed to be told. John did not find riches. There was no sudden change of fortune. But he found something more enduring. He found purpose. Back at the cabin, the air seemed different. The weight that had pressed on him for years began to lift. Buck lay beside him, his head resting on John's knee. John began speaking. At gatherings, online, in quiet rooms with other veterans, he spoke of his own battles, of silence, and of finding the courage to confront the past. John became more than a man chasing answers. He became a voice for others who could not speak. For them, the chest was more than an object. It was a catalyst. And for John Mercer, the chest changed everything. Not through wealth, but through meaning, through restoring a sense of direction, a reason to rise again each day. He looked down at Buck and smiled softly. "We did it, boy." "We found it," Buck wagged his tail gently. Outside, the rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking. John felt something he hadn't in years: hope.